4,000 years ago, Ra ruled our universe without question. In another age, we looked to the sky and knew that Zeus commanded the thunder, or Jupiter, Thor even, depending on where we were in the world. Then we moved on. Marduk, Baal, Shiva, Quetzalcoatl. The time and location bring new gods. Today, we may believe in Jesus, Allah, the teachings of Buddha, to name a few. Or perhaps we don't believe at all. We've got thousands of gods to choose from. So we have to wonder, which one is right? If you too ruled over the universe without question, check out Pantheon, our brand inspired by myths, legend and folklore. We ship worldwide and are rated excellent in Trustpilot. Link in the description. I'm sure this won't start any arguments. What is a god? According to the Oxford Dictionary, a god is defined as a superhuman being or spirit worshipped as having power over nature or human fortunes. Simple enough, right? But philosophers have spent thousands of years arguing that this definition barely scratches the surface. The word God has been used to describe everything from storm spirits and tribal guardians to abstract philosophical principles that supposedly lie at the foundation of the universe. When thinkers began examining the idea seriously, they quickly realized that the concept was far more complicated than a powerful supernatural being. The ancient Greek philosopher Plato was one of the first to challenge the traditional gods of mythology. In Greek stories, the gods behaved very much like humans with unlimited power. They lied, deceived one another, fought wars, became jealous, and pursued personal desires. Plato believed this created a serious contradiction. If a god represents the highest form of existence, then such a being should not be morally flawed. To Plato, true divinity had to represent something perfect and unchanging. A divine being should embody goodness, order, and rationality rather than the chaotic personalities found in mythological stories. His criticism marked an important shift. Instead of treating gods as characters in stories, philosophers began to ask whether gods must represent something fundamentally higher than human behavior. Plato's student, Aristotle, approached the question from a completely different direction. Rather than asking what a god should be morally, he asked why the universe exists at all. He observed that everything in the world appears to be caused by something else. A seed grows because it receives sunlight and water. A fire burns because fuel and oxygen are present. Motion always seems to depend on something that initiates it. Aristotle realized that if every event depends on a previous cause, the chain of causes cannot stretch backward forever. If there were no beginning to this chain, nothing would ever start. For Aristotle, the logical conclusion was that there must be a first cause that started the motion of the universe without itself being caused. He called this the unmoved mover. This being represented an eternal source of motion and order that sustains the existence of the universe. More than 1,000 years later, medieval theologian Thomas Aquinas adopted Aristotle's reasoning and developed it into one of the most influential arguments in Christian theology. If everything in existence depends on something else, then the entire chain must ultimately rest on something that exists independently. Aquinas called this the necessary being, a being that doesn't depend on anything else in order to exist. Everything else is contingent and could potentially fail to exist, but the necessary being must exist by its very nature. Without such a foundation, Aquinas argued, nothing could exist at all. This necessary existence was what people mean when they speak about God. In the 17th century, however, the philosopher Baruch Spinoza challenged the assumption that God must be separate from the universe. Spinoza rejected the idea of a personal God who watches over creation or intervenes in human life. Instead, he argued that the universe is the only true substance that exists. Everything we observe is simply part of one infinite reality. Spinoza used the word God to describe this totality. In his view, God was the universe itself, expressed through the laws of nature and the structure of existence. This interpretation radically changed the meaning of the word God, transforming it from a supernatural ruler into a philosophical description of reality. By the 19th century, the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche believed that the traditional idea of God had begun to collapse entirely. When Nietzsche famously wrote that God is dead, he wasn't describing the literal death of a divine being, but observing a cultural transformation taking place throughout Europe. Scientific discoveries, historical criticism of religious texts, and the rise of modern philosophy were gradually eroding the unquestioned authority that religion had held for centuries. The death of God meant that the moral and philosophical systems built around religious belief were losing their foundation. Humanity was entering a period in which people would have to create meaning and values without relying on a higher authority. Across more than 2,000 years of philosophical thought, the concept of God had taken on dramatically different meanings. The deeper philosophers investigated the idea, the less agreement they found. Which leads to a surprising conclusion. Before we can decide which God might be right, we first have to confront a more basic problem. Over thousands of years of philosophy, religion, and theology, we've never even agreed on what a God actually is. Of course, you may already have your own thoughts on what God is, and that, my friends, is the beauty of the question. So we've looked into the who and the what of God, right? But what about the how and the why? Across continents and centuries, societies independently developed beliefs about gods. Civilizations, separated by oceans, languages, and thousands of years, repeatedly arrive at divine figures that share striking similarities. Storm gods appear in cultures that never had contact with one another. Sun gods emerge wherever the sky dominates the landscape. Gods of the dead arise wherever humans attempt to understand what happens after life ends. The recurrence of these figures through distant cultures suggests that these beings are recurring responses to the same experiences. For most of our history, the natural world was powerful, unpredictable, and largely unexplained. Thunder could shatter the sky without warning. Floods could drown entire settlements. Drought could destroy crops and bring famine to a community that depended on the land. Without the scientific evidence we rely on today, early societies faced a world filled with forces that seemed intentional and overwhelming. Attributing them to supernatural beings provided a way to interpret events that otherwise appeared chaotic and terrifying. In this context, many of the most common gods begin to make sense. Lightning becomes the weapon of a warrior who commands the storm. The sun becomes a ruler crossing the heavens each day, bringing light and warmth to the world. Death becomes the domain of a judge who determines the fate of human souls. These explanations transformed mysterious natural events into narratives that could be understood and passed from generation to generation. Belief in gods also offered something equally important, a sense of control. If the storm belonged to a god, then perhaps rituals, sacrifices, or prayers could influence that god's behavior. If the harvest depended on favor, then ceremonies could be performed to secure successful seasons. Over time, these beliefs expanded beyond explanations of nature and became woven into society. Kings ruled by claiming divine authority. Laws were presented as commands given by gods rather than decisions made by human rulers. Moral behavior became tied to obedience toward an order that stood above ordinary life. In many cultures, gods became the ultimate source of legitimacy, explaining why societies were organized the way they were. The recurrence of these ideas raises an important possibility. The existence of gods in human culture may reveal as much about the human mind as it does about the universe. The right God often depends on geography. Where we're born historically played a powerful role in determining which god or gods we grow up believing in. A child born in ancient Greece would hear stories of Zeus and the Olympian gods. A child born in medieval Scandinavia would grow up learning about Odin and Thor. A child born in the Middle East might be raised believing in the God of Abraham. In each case, these beliefs would be taught as the truth about how the universe works. The gods of a culture are embedded in stories, rituals, and laws that shape society. We rarely begin life as neutral investigators weighing competing religious claims. Instead, we're born into cultures where explanations for reality already exist, passed down from generation to generation, and by the time someone is old enough to question the world around them, the beliefs in which they understand reality are often already firmly in place. And today, the global distribution of religion still reflects these patterns. Christianity dominates regions shaped by centuries of Christian influence. Islam is strongest in the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Asia, shaped by Islamic civilization. Hindu traditions remain concentrated in India. Buddhism remains strongest in East and Southeast Asia. Despite centuries of migration, colonization, and cultural exchange, belief still follows geography in remarkably consistent ways. If belief in a particular god is strongly influenced where someone happens to be born, then two people raised in different parts of the world may grow up equally convinced of completely different religious truths. A Christian in Brazil may believe with absolute certainty that the God of the Bible created the universe. A Muslim in Saudi Arabia may feel the same certainty about Allah. A Hindu in India may believe with equal conviction in the divine reality described in the Vedas. Each may feel supported by tradition, community, and personal experience. Yet the conclusions they reach about the nature of God are often fundamentally different. Modern technology has complicated this picture even further. For most of human history, people rarely encountered competing religions. Today, however, billions of people live in multicultural societies where multiple religions exist side by side. The Internet allows anyone to explore belief systems from anywhere in the world. And yet, geography still plays an enormous role. Even in the modern world, most continue to believe in the religion they were raised with. Cultural inheritance remains one of the strongest predictors of religious beliefs. If two individuals inherit different religious frameworks through geography and culture, they both feel equally convinced that their belief represents the truth about the universe. So then, how can humanity determine which belief is correct? Philosophers call this the problem of religious pluralism. Billions of people hold deep and sincere beliefs about God that cannot all be true in exactly the same way at the same time. Each tradition includes intelligent thinkers, centuries of theology, sacred texts, and generations of believers who are fully convinced that they have encountered truth. And yet the answers they arrive at are very different. Which brings us back to the question that started this entire discussion. If thousands of gods have been worshipped across human history and billions of people inherit their beliefs through the accident of geography, how do we determine which one is actually right? Perhaps, how do we determine which God is actually right isn't the question we should be asking. Perhaps the more difficult question is whether it's even possible to determine which God is right at all. History provides an interesting reason to consider this possibility. Our civilization is filled with religions that were once believed with complete certainty. Then we buried them and moved on. Ancient Egypt provides one of the clearest examples. For thousands of years, Egyptian civilization centered its religious life around a complex pantheon that included Ra, Osiris, Isis, and Anubis. Temples were constructed across the Nile Valley, priests performed elaborate rituals, and the authority of the pharaoh himself was closely connected to divine approval. Egyptian religion shaped the state, influenced law and morality, and governed beliefs about death and the afterlife. These gods were the forces that governed reality. A similar certainty existed in the ancient Mediterranean world. In Greece, the Olympian gods were believed to influence war, politics, weather, and fate. City-states maintained temples to figures such as Zeus, Athena, and Apollo, and religious festivals formed an essential part of civic life. In Rome, the same pattern continued through the worship of Jupiter, Mars, and Venus. Religious devotion was a central feature of political and cultural identity. Further east, the civilizations of Mesopotamia developed their own divine systems centered around figures such as Marduk, Ishtar, and Baal. Their temples stood at the center of urban life, and priests interpreted their will through rituals and omens that were believed to reveal the intentions of the gods. Across these societies, religious belief was the foundation upon which entire civilizations understood the universe. Yet over time, this gradually faded. As cultures changed, empires collapsed, and new traditions spread, the gods that once defined these societies slowly lost their place. The temples remained as historical monuments, the stories survived in literature and mythology, but the certainty that once surrounded these deities eventually disappeared. The people who believed in these gods never expected them to disappear. Their gods were the truth, permanent features of reality, as certain as the sun, the sky, or the earth beneath their feet. The religions that people practice today often feel equally permanent to those who believe in them. Texts are interpreted as timeless revelations. Traditions are passed down through generations, and religious institutions present their teachings as truths about the nature of the universe. Yet when viewed across the full span of human history, belief systems appear far more fluid than they feel from within a single generation. We repeatedly construct religious frameworks that appear stable and unquestionable during the period in which they are dominant. Over time, this can weaken, transform, or disappear entirely as new ideas emerge. The historical record, therefore, raises an important philosophical problem. If many religions that were once believed with complete certainty eventually faded from human belief, then the confidence that people feel in their own religious tradition may not necessarily guarantee it'll be around forever. Who's to say in the future that our modern-day beliefs won't be added to the long catalogue of mythology? Then there's a problem of religious diversity. I don't mean the problem as in it's a bad thing. Diversity is great, of course, but it does add another layer to the challenge of finding the right God. When you look at religions side by side, we're presented with completely different realities. Do we have one God or many gods that are responsible for different forces of nature or aspects of life? Do we have one life, or do we return via reincarnation, heaven, hell, another state of existence? Does God exist beyond our universe, or is he here with us? These are fundamentally different explanations of how the universe works and what our place in it might be. If sincere and intelligent people over the world arrive at completely different conclusions about the nature of God, what does that tell us? One response comes from the philosopher John Hick, who suggested that the diversity of religions may reflect different cultural interpretations of the same ultimate reality. According to Hick, human beings may be encountering something beyond themselves, something called the real. But the way that experience is interpreted depends heavily on culture, language, and tradition. A Christian may understand that experience through the teachings of the Bible, a Muslim through the Quran, a Hindu through the ideas in the Vedas. He explains that the differences between religions don't necessarily mean that all but one must be false. Instead, they may represent different human attempts to describe something that ultimately lies beyond complete understanding. But not everyone finds this explanation convincing. The American philosopher William James studied religious experience itself and noticed that many people across different traditions report powerful encounters with what they believe to be the divine. These experiences often feel intensely real to the individuals who have them and can dramatically transform their lives. Yet those same experiences lead people toward very different religious frameworks. A Christian mystic may interpret the experience of a relationship with God, while a Buddhist practitioner may interpret something similar as an encounter with enlightenment or ultimate reality. For James, this suggested that religious experience is genuine in the sense that it deeply affects human lives, but doesn't necessarily settle the question of which interpretation is correct. Other philosophers take a more traditional approach and argue that disagreement between religions doesn't automatically undermine the truth of any one of them. The philosopher Alvin Plantinga, for example, argues that belief can be still rational even in the presence of competing traditions. People disagree about political systems, moral questions, and philosophical theories all the time. The existence of disagreement doesn't necessarily mean that truth cannot exist. A believer may still consider their own religious experience to be sufficient grounds for faith, even while acknowledging that others reach different conclusions. Despite these different responses, the underlying challenge remains difficult to escape. But what if there is no God? A deeply uncomfortable idea for many. But in the modern world, science has introduced a very different way of understanding the universe. Ideas are examined and challenged and refined as new discoveries are made. Explanations must survive scrutiny and experimentation before they are accepted, which presents a picture that looks very different from the one described in religious narratives. The Big Bang theory describes a universe that began roughly 13.8 billion years ago and has been expanding ever since. Galaxies formed, stars ignited, planets emerged, and eventually life appeared on at least one small world orbiting a star. Evolution explains how we developed from a far simpler form of life. Life on Earth began as microscopic organisms billions of years ago, which slowly changed. Some adapted better to their environment and survived, passing those traits forward. Across millions of years, those small changes built up upon another. Life grew more complex. Fish appeared in the oceans, plants spread throughout land, reptiles dominated the planet, and eventually mammals emerged, followed by humans. There was no garden, no humans formed from clay, no gods shaping people from dust. Just a long, gradual process unfolding over immense stretches of time. These ideas were deeply controversial when first presented, yet over time the evidence supporting evolution became overwhelming. And then there are miracles, events that appear to suspend the moral laws of nature. A virgin woman giving birth, a man walking on water, dying and returning to life after 3 days, gods taking physical form within the world and interacting directly with humanity. Seas parting, the sun standing still in the sky, prophets splitting the moon, saints healing the sick with a touch, enlightened figures performing supernatural feats beyond the limits of human ability. Science works on evidence, and as of now, scientists will say there's no concrete evidence of the existence of any god. It's often said that if every holy book were destroyed today, in 1,000 years the new versions would likely look very different from the ones we have now. But if every scientific book were destroyed, in 1,000 years they would be written again the same. The same experiments would produce the same results. There is belief in God, in gods even, of course. Billions hold that belief sincerely. But belief and evidence are not the same. So let's circle back to the question. If there are thousands of gods, which is the right one? If you're expecting a definitive answer from me, I'm going to have to disappoint. I'm going to be boring and sit on the fence. The real question for me, at least, is, does it matter? Whatever you choose to believe, as long as it brings you peace, purpose, and perhaps encourages kindness towards others, it's already serving its purpose. The truth is that humanity has never stopped searching for answers. Some people look to gods, some people look to science, some look inwards, and maybe that's the real story. Not that we've found the final answer, but that we never stopped asking the question.